head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
주체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 주체의 강중대국을 우리 어떻게 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그 배짱으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao Mao. Le riz est fou et moi je joue Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see. And the Prince of Wales, he said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo-raloo-raloo, they're looking for monkeys up in the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connan baked a cake, and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake, pretending I was barmy. Tooraloo-raloo-raloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo-raloo-raloo, me curse upon the Labour blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he beat the enemy with his mouth and saved the British Army. Tooraloo-raloo-raloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und zieht schon der Sehnsucht Ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeiter macht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor, dass wir sie zur Sonne heben, bei Tag in der Kampf beschworen. Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die uns die
холостяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы.
Turn the microphone on, so there you go. Perils of having to do everything yourself and not using an automated program. So try again. Good morning, everybody, and welcome along. It is the morning of the 18th of February 2025, and we are coming to you today with live stream on the latest cynical bullshit from Sir Keir Starmer. Always important to give a man the title which he has very much earned. And what we'll be doing today is discussing that and some other issues that have come out of the latest, shall we say, merry-go-round of the Ukraine war, and taking questions as well. So we will get straight into it. And of course, by straight into it, I mean we will cover, of course, the cowardly, cynical, manipulative bullshitting of Keir Starmer, which is solely designed to keep the Ukraine war going at all costs, and mostly the costs being paid in the form of Ukrainian lives. So we will get to that. I'm just going to headphone myself up here. So, what we will be doing is looking at the latest here from Keir Starmer and taking that in. So, we will get now to the first clip of the day, which is, of course, Sir Keir talking about his commitment to Ukraine. And some might say that he's about as committed to Ukraine as he is to his wife. Google it if you don't understand the gag there. So let's go with our old friend Sir Keir talking recently.
On defence, it's clear the US. On defence, it's clear the US is not going to leave NATO. But we Europeans will have to do more. The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing. And Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump and to discuss what we see as the key elements of a lasting peace. I spoke to President Zelensky on Friday, and will do so again in coming days. And we envisage a further meeting with European colleagues when I return from the US. In this
Right, so you all heard the man there. Just going to do some adjustments to the volume of the mic there. I think that probably works a little bit better. Let me know if the volume is too high or too low. So, the whole clip there from Keir Starmer is, of course, marked by his usual slippery, dishonest, mendacious nonsense, but it does betray a couple of things. First of all, one thing he said there is true. The US is not leaving NATO. The US is not leaving Europe either. So on that point, Sir Keir is 100% correct. And if you've watched the videos here before, you will know exactly why Sir Keir is telling the truth there, which is that the US has within its capabilities and within its economic setup the need to export and continue to find a market to export $3.5 trillion worth to every year, and to get approximately the same amount back as foreign direct investment into the United States. Now, it may be that in the future, and this maybe is part of like the Trump faction's plan, that they're going to find other markets that'll be profitable enough to send that amount of capital to every year. At the moment, such markets don't exist. So the US is not leaving Europe. NATO is not being dismantled. On that, our old friend Sir Keir is unfortunately correct. No, the US capitalist class is not going to walk away from the size of market in terms of investments that Europe can provide. Nowhere else can stand in for it. So, on that point, our old clenched-teethed, girdled friend is correct. Now, the rest of it was, of course, blather. He talked about Europe stepping up and spending more on defence, and you see our old friend Paul Mason has been doing the rounds on the Sunday talk shows, looking like a particularly coked-up, hairless ferret, to steal a line from the late, great Bill Hicks when applied to Dan Quayle. What you see is a series of absolutely delusional ravings from like European and British commentators about spending more on defence. Now, assume for a moment that they do. You're going to spend more on defence, throwing more money into a system which the Ministry of Defence's own reports admit is horrendously inefficient, and where money just disappears out of the back door, and the actual production that's done is simply, nowhere near to what they say they want, because the British industrial base has been hollowed out, and to the idea that you can have purely a defense sector without a wider scientific and technological base, without a wider manufacturing base, well, that's being proven wrong by the actions of the US itself, who and the US ruling class, or some of them, suddenly realizing that just keeping on a defense sector and gutting the rest of your industrial base doesn't really work either. Now, the British have done both. They've gutted their industrial base and gutted their defense sector. So where is this extra money going to go? To actually recreate a viable defense industrial production base, you need a wider plan to revive manufacturing in this country. And Keir Starmer isn't going to do that, nor are any of his potential successors. Wesley Streeting, Andy Burnham in the Labour Party, maybe some others, or the Tory Reform Coalition that may well win the next election. But given the way opinion polls stand at the moment, is almost certain to win the next election. So none of these pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist parties in Britain has the slightest clue or desire to actually revive domestic manufacturing at all. What you're seeing here is the Keir Starmer moaning and complaining, because basically it's not even that the US has completely ditched and abandoned the regime change project regarding the Russian Federation. It's that the US has changed tactics. Now, this is, of course, very upsetting to Sir Keir and his crew, who had gambled an awful lot of money on immediate success in the Ukraine war. Now, the Ukraine war has failed. The smarter people in the US ruling class and their various think tanks know that very well. They know that it's failed, which is why they're shifting tactics. Now, we will come to what they are shifting tactics towards in just a moment. Before that, I wanted to share with you more pearls of wisdom from our beloved Prime Minister, Sir Keir. Now, he has taken to the Daily Telegraph, which is, of course, the newspaper of choice of like the most bilious reactionaries in this country. I think it's read almost entirely by retired army generals in the home counties. So Starmer, I doubt he wrote this. It's probably ghostwritten for him by, I don't know, Paul Mason. He says a couple of interesting things, though, in this article. He makes the usual bullshit claim that Russia has designs on all of Europe. He's now saying we need to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position ahead of any talks. He's also making the claim, as he did in that statement we played just a moment ago, that Britain is ready to play a leading role. This is a direct quote from the article. The UK, a term I despise, by the way, is ready to play a leading role in accelerating work on security guarantees for Ukraine. This includes further support for Ukraine's military, where the UK has already committed $3 billion a year until at least 2030. I doubt most of that will get paid. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. So, this has been interpreted as Keir Starmer threatens to march on Sevastopol. And again, this has been interpreted that way by a series of luridly sensational garbage merchants in, shall we say, the extremely online media world. I'll say to this that Keir Starmer cannot even muster up the level of forces that the British Army sent to fight the Tsarist army in the 1850s in the original Crimean War. Like, according to retired Commodore Steve Jermy, whose article myself and Kit Clarenberg discussed on the last Decline and Fall episode, the British Army and the German army can't fight the Russians. They don't have the capability to take on the Russian ground forces. They don't have really the capability of trying to dominate the Black Sea. They don't have the capability to deal with the very advanced Russian air defense systems, and they certainly don't have the number or quality, level of quality necessary in their ground forces to take on a very experienced and very numerous Russian army. Neither the French, the Germans, the British themselves, the Spanish, the Italians have what it takes to go in there and fight. But let's go back to Sir Keir's statement, because he's being typically slippery in all of this. Now, what Sir Keir wants you to take away from this is that British troops to Ukraine. But let's read the sentence again. Sentence reads as follows. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. And what does he mean by that? Means it in a so-called peacekeeping role. This is the same idea that was floated by Emmanuel Macron a while ago, and it was an idea that was shot down by the Russians at the time, that they would not accept it. And it's also something that the US isn't interested in pursuing. And without the US, there is going to be no deployment of Britain, by Britain, France, Germany, or anybody else, of forces to Ukraine. The only way that European or British or any other kind of force from the West enters into what's left of Ukraine is if it is done with the cooperation of the agreement, tacit or otherwise, of the Russian Federation. That's the only way this happens, because the idea that any of these countries is ready and willing to go to war with the Russians is a joke. They all know they can't do it, which is why Sir Keir is using that typically slippery language. And it's why the people screaming that that Keir is marching off to war are also very, very wrong and being so incredibly irresponsible. Because if you've studied the British Armed Forces and the British industrial base, you'll know very well that they couldn't last a week against the Russians. And nor could they even resupply the very small forces they have available to them. They can't even restock the necessary amount of tanks that would be required because they don't have the production capacity to produce these Challenger 2s anymore. So this is all nonsense. It's always been nonsense. The European forces do not have the capacity to fight the Russians. The only ones who could conceivably do it are the US, and the US ruling class are not interested in getting involved in that war. They were interested in using Ukraine as a battering ram against the Russians, but the main weapon was always going to be not to be found on the Ukraine battlefield. Main weapon against the Russians was always going to be sanctions, economic pressure, and the hope of a palace coup within Russia that would destroy the Putin system. That would be the hope. That would be their ideal outcome. As I have said many times before, but I will repeat now, the idea of this war was never that Ukraine was going to win on the battlefield against the Russian armed forces. Everybody, even the most bullshit-addled general in the West, knew that to be the case. What it was meant to do, the Ukrainian armed forces, was to create the sense of a battlefield disaster for the Russians, if not the reality of it. Remember how much they've put into presentation of Ukrainian fake victories, how many events they've staged to make it look as if Ukraine is winning, how many times they've said that the Russian army is running away, that the Russian army is finished, all that kind of blather. This was all meant to be part of a much more comprehensive strategy, that of the information war that would only be tangentially related to actual events on the battlefield. What was needed was not a Ukraine victory as such, but that the Ukrainian army could deliver the convincing appearance of one that would then be broadcast into Russia, that would then be seized upon by the British and American intelligence assets that are in play in Russia, many of whom used to dwell or maybe are dormant within the Russian ruling class and Russian governing circles, who would then push Putin and his group out of power, bring back the Yeltsin period, basically. And this, of course, proved impossible to do. The Russian economy didn't collapse in the way that they hoped that it would, because if their sanctions regime had worked, if their PR war had delivered, if they had managed to create the sense of catastrophe and crisis within Russia that they aimed to create, then their calculations, that is the imperialist calculations, may well have been correct. That they could have provoked a palace coup had they managed to fulfill the conditions which were necessary for them to do so. Now, as it turns out, they didn't have the assets on the ground that would have been necessary for them to trigger this palace coup. They weren't able to create the pervasive sense of total crisis facing the Russian state. And they weren't able to manufacture enough victories on the Ukrainian battlefield to actually get to the point where they could even hope to trigger the appearance of a crisis. This all went wrong, but that was the plan. It was never that Ukraine was meant to actually really defeat Russia on the battlefield. It was meant to be looking as if it could. That's all that was required. So, going back to our friend Sir Keir, he uses the usual blather and says, and again, his usual deceptive nonsense, where he says, we cannot have another situation like Afghanistan where the US negotiated directly with the Taliban and cut out the Afghan government. I feel sure that President Trump will want to avoid this too. Well, the the bald truth is that the Trump group is, well, at the moment, I don't think they have an actual plan in place. I still stick by my assertion on that. But whether they included the Afghan government in negotiations with the Taliban or not is utterly irrelevant, because the Taliban moved and the Afghan government collapsed. The Afghan government collapsed because it had no real existence outside of the realms of, well, the support that it was given directly by the United States. The same is true for the Maidan regime, which is now widely despised inside Ukraine. And even Western observers have to admit that there is, again, a significant resistance movement against the Kiev regime inside what are nominally Ukrainian-controlled territories. So this is something which is a growing problem for the Kiev regime. Zelensky is despised. They are all discredited. They have all made it clear they're prepared to see Ukraine burnt to the ground rather than admit defeat. These people know, the Kiev regime hierarchy know very well that many Ukrainians would give them the Mussolini treatment if they could possibly get hold of them. So the idea that this Ukrainian regime could survive peace is a joke. And I think the more sensible people inside the US ruling class, the ones who are one foot in reality at least, understand that it's a joke. They understand that the Kiev regime depends entirely upon the largesse of the United States. It has no legitimacy left. If it had very little to start with, whether it was ruled over by Yatsenyuk, by Poroshenko, or Zelensky. Now Zelensky's credibility is drained away to nothing. If the US chooses to turn off the aid tap, then it would collapse in about a couple of days. So, and this will continue to be the case, because if the US is changing tactics, and again about which more in a moment, then the Europeans will probably be left bearing the burden of a chaotic, squalid regime in Kiev if one is left there and under any agreement between the US and the Russians. So that is, and if that gets pushed into EU membership, which is being talked about, then that will be a gigantic mess, which the Germans and the French will be principally left to deal with. I don't think they'll want to deal with, to be completely honest. And so Starmer can blather on about this and about NATO membership being inevitable to and an irreversible path for Ukraine to join the NATO alliance. Well, he can say all that, but if the US says no, then it's not going to happen. That's the truth of it. And currently the US administration is saying no for their own reasons, and so it will not happen. Now, there are some other elements of this article, though, where Starmer gets slightly closer to the truth. Not by any intention, but here we go. We will read it anyway. He starts off the next paragraph with a delusion, saying we should also show greater strength in applying economic pressure. Putin's economy is feeling the strain. Apparently Putin owns the entire Russian economy. That's why he's the richest man on earth, if you believe the corpse of Alexei Navalny. He is worried about his energy revenues in his financial sector. Now, this is, of course, Starmer's deluded about the potential impact of sanctions. More sanctions actually isn't going to do the trick. Now, what is the case, though, and the reason why the hope of the West was not as deluded and insane as some people like to portray it as, is that the Russian capitalist class, the Russian ruling class, have lost out through the sanctions regime, as they were meant to. Bear in mind, the sanctions regime is meant to produce a palace coup in Russia. And the analysis of the Western intelligence services when it comes to the Russian political system proved to be inaccurate in 2022, 2023, 2024. But they do understand, the British and the US and the French and the Germans, they do understand that the Putin system, being a Bonapartist system, is based on a sometimes more durable, sometimes more fragile coalition of interests. And the Russian capitalist class are part of that. Now, I have said before and I am going to repeat this here, that the Russian capitalist class is a completely degenerate, completely pathetic, completely parasitic, completely useless entity that was utterly useless when it was owned by the British and the French prior to 1917. And when it was recreated out of the capitalist layer in the later Soviet Union, proved every bit as useless, every bit as treasonous, every bit as spineless, and every bit as comprador as their Tsarist-era predecessors. So, the calculation of the imperialists, as Keir gives away there and in that paragraph we just read, is that enough pressure put on the Russian ruling class will trigger a revolt. Now, in that sense, again, his calculation isn't entirely wrong, because the Russian capitalist class are the ones who have been will cry the hardest and be the most treacherous with regard to the effect of sanctions. So again, the calculation of Starmer and Biden and co wasn't entirely wrong on that. What was the case, though, was that the Russian security system was adequate enough to deal with any plots and eliminate any threats that did arise. But the pressure from the Russian capitalist class is still there. The Russian capitalist class, for all that many of them have gotten themselves involved with like ultra-orthodox, pious nationalist movements, for all that there are certain alleged Russian podcasters who have a fetish for Tsarism and wants to apparently recreate the Tsarist empire to some extent. I mean, a lot of this is just sort of online memeing, but it does represent like the bullshitting of the Russian capitalist class. What's the reality of the Russian capitalist class, and also what's the reality of one of the fringe philosophers of the Russian bourgeois, which is of course Mr. Dugin, which is what you get from the Russian capitalist class now is about the same as what you got from the Russian capitalist class prior to World War One, which is a lot of noise about great Russia, we will not be cowed, the Russian army is the strongest, we are a great Christian people, we will stand against the filth of the West, we know how to run a country like Russia, we will be strong, etc., etc. Damn those insert name of foreign agitators here. You get the picture. Nothing particularly unique about it, in all honesty. So, what is the reality of the Russian capitalist class, though? For all of its proclamations of orthodoxy, of faith, family, fatherland, etc., the reality is they're the same squalid group of comprador scum that they have always been. And so if the imperialists, and this is what they're doing, are looking at them and thinking, well, these guys will roll over and play dead if we offer them like a few crumbs. Yes, that calculation is correct. The imperialist gamble would be correct if the Russian capitalist class had the power to completely surrender in 2014 or 2022, then they would have done so very quickly and covered it up with a whole lot of blather about the Russian soul or some other shit, because that was Yeltsin. You got a lot of Yeltsinites went on that way. Now, fortunately for Russia, the balance of forces is that within Russia does not favor the compradors. It does not favor the comprador capitalists because of domestic pressure, which has to be said that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is crucial to this. There is an element of that there are certain national bourgeois elements represented within the Putin system as well. That their ability to roll over and die for the imperialists was compromised. So, what of now though? What are we to make by the Trump administration changing tactics? Well, they're changing tactics because they are sticking to like the two tactics that have been used against Russia since the year 2000, maybe even earlier, which is on the one hand try unremitting hostility, and if that doesn't work, try to bring on side some compradors. That's the second route. They're now reverting to the second route, which is give some certain concessions to the Russians in Ukraine. So give up the 4 regions, tell Zelensky it's all over, you're not getting any of that back, you're not getting Crimea back. All, make peace with it, mate. Go into exile in that villa in Florida that you've got under your wife's name, if she'll still go with you. Now, the aim of the Trump administration is to break up the what is forming in terms of the BRIC system and the multipolar world, such as it is called, and their aim is to break away the Russian Federation from the Chinese. Now, whether they will succeed in that or not is another question. I doubt that they will. This is one of the things that you cannot accuse Putin of, is making short-sighted decisions on certain issues. So the strategic alignment of the Russian Federation with China is about the long-term interests of both countries. And there may be, in fact there are, some inside the Russian system who would walk away from that, throw it all overboard, sell out completely, and just become a raw resource appendage for the Europeans again. That's what some of them in the Russian system are desperate to do. Others, though, are not. Others take a much longer-term vision. And the longer-term vision takes them towards increasingly deep alliances with the Chinese, with the Iranians, and with others in the East. Now, the question is, who is going to be the prevailing influence within the Putin system? There are some immediately screaming that the Russians are going to capitulate and sell out. It's a possibility. Depends upon which force is active in the system. Certainly, Zyuganov, the General Secretary of the KPRF, has issued a warning at the end of January that there are many inside the Russian system who are prepared to roll over and die for Trump. And again, that's completely true. Now, whether they are strong enough to do so is another question. Certainly, that is what the US imperialists are calculating or banking on, is that the comprador elements within the Russian system will be strong enough to make concessions to the US, to allow the US to retain its influence in what is left of Ukraine, even if there's no NATO. But there is EU membership. That's Putin said that he wouldn't oppose, that the Russians wouldn't oppose Ukrainian EU membership. So the EU membership for Ukraine, sanctions relief, allow Western capital to go back into Russia and to re-establish itself there. That is the gamble that the Trump administration is taking. Get Western capital back into Russia again, reintegrate Russia into the Western system, and stop the maximum pressure campaign. By doing that, the Trump group hopes that they can encourage the growth of comprador tendencies within the Russian system. Because the comprador tendencies are strengthened by what? By access to Western capital, by access to Western markets, by continual infusions of capital coming from the imperialist countries, and flowing from that by the cultural in political influence of the Western imperialist powers. And this was something that was done quite effectively in the 90s. It ran out of juice in the end following the economic disaster of 1998. So the way in which the Trump administration clearly hopes that this will go is that relaxation of sanctions will allow the regrowth of the pro-US comprador element in the Russian system. That is what they want. Now, that will take some time, but that's what they're gambling upon. And that is the way it will ultimately be presented to the Europeans, and it will be something that ultimately the Europeans will have to accept. Now, will the US, therefore, do what is being talked about, which is withdraw troops from the Baltic states or something like that? Now, this is an important consideration. Now, will the US give the Russians that kind of visible win? Is the question. My prediction is that they will end up not doing that, and they will end up not doing that because the rest of NATO will scream and yell and kick up a huge fuss and refuse to withdraw their troops from the Baltic states, and the US doesn't want to sacrifice NATO. So you may see some juggling around of US forces, but they won't retreat too far away from Russia's borders. The question is then, does the Russian leadership pursue the aims that they outlined in the draft treaties proposed to the US and NATO in December of 2021? If you remember, that one of those includes the clause that US forces and Western NATO forces should withdraw from all of the countries that were admitted to NATO after 1997. Now, they're not going to do that. Are they going to make any nods towards that? I think they probably will end up not doing so. But this is the game. Now, Starmer's objecting to all of this because he still is acting upon the orders of the people who he's followed orders from his entire career, which is the British security state apparatus, who are like a bunch of ultra diehard reactionaries, as is Keir Starmer, by the way. He's always been diehard reactionary, a vicious imperialist, and a diehard racist. No, he might not dress up as a member of Patriotic Alternative and try and burn down a hostel full of asylum seekers, but then again, he's the one who he's one of the characters who stuffs the asylum seekers in a hostel and then encourages pogroms. So who's more responsible, the guy who throws the petrol bomb or the guy who sets up the situation in the first place? Anyhow, the British ruling class is feeling rather sore over Ukraine because they invested a lot into it and hoped to get a return from the reimposition of Yeltsinism inside Russia, and so far that this has not paid off for them. The US, though, is about to, if it gets what it's looking for out of the Russians, will just tell its European allies to fall into line. And they will dutifully do so, because, again, without the US alliance, then European imperialism is finished. And that is why, ultimately, when the US says jump, they all have to say how high, because they have no room to operate independently in any way. Right. So, I'm going to pause now and go back to take some questions. So let's see. Go back to the top. Say we will be greeting and saying, well, good afternoon as it is now to Svetlana in Moscow, and to good morning to Grassy Knoll out there in Seattle. Must be pretty early where you are. Okay, some interesting comments from Svetlana, our correspondent in Moscow, who says the following. Men aged 18 to 24 are being offered a payout of $24,000 interest-free mortgages and social benefits if they join up. Authorities claim 10,000 men have already taken up the offer. Wives and mothers are now promised $4,500 for revealing the whereabouts of husbands and sons hiding from the draft. A land fit for heroes. The pension granted to a badly wounded soldier is $66 a month, i.e. $2.35 a day. In short, all he can afford is a bottle of milk and a cheap loaf of bread per day. Interesting. Are you referring to Ukraine there, Svetlana? Can you clarify if you are? Luca, greetings to you out here in Perfidious Albion, and greetings to Daniel, comrade out there in the West Country. Luca asks, greetings from Perfidious Albion. Alex, can I ask if the US are mainly trying to protect the areas in proximity of the front line where they have investments? Well, that will be part of it. They'll be looking to get a deal out of the Russians with regard to the rare earth metals in Ukraine. Of course, a lot of this depends upon whether the Kiev regime can survive or not. That's why they'll want to get rid of Zelensky to try and bring back some legitimacy to it. But the danger is if they try and get rid of him in a way that's like what they did to Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam, then they'll end up unleashing more chaos. They'll want a more orderly transition. Zelensky knows that, so he will be driving a hard bargain to get himself the maximum payoff possible. So, yeah, they'll want a deal on the rare earth metals, I think. And also, they'll want a deal that enables them to control the Kiev regime. I mean, Ivan Kachanovsky, the exiled Ukrainian academic, has covered this recently, saying that basically Trump and co have laid out demands to Zelensky for essentially reparations being paid from Ukraine to the US. In reality, it should be the other way around, of course. So they will aim to control the Kiev regime and aim to control its natural resources. They'll want to protect what investments they've got in the West. The question is always, and this is something that always frequently undoes the imperialist plans, is, well, what will the masses of Ukraine have to say about this? If they have to surrender the 4 regions plus Crimea, if they have to then basically get owned and controlled by the West, then and their resources systematically asset stripped, then there will ultimately be revolts against the Kiev regime, which will threaten it anyway. So this isn't over by a long stretch of the imagination. Ukraine crisis is not going to end anytime soon if Trump carries through on this plan. Okay. Hello to also Tim Gray. Good to have you with us. And Daniel says the case with libertarians is they have to read Lenin's imperialism and realize that there's no such thing as capitalism going wrong, but capitalism doing what it's meant to do. Yes, indeed. Okay, hello to Bruce Albert, Drummond Base, also Robeson, Mo 1917, Comrade Jawad, N. Kenchington, who comes to us from rural Thailand, Almir from the once and future socialist Slovenia, Yugoslavia, Jay from Norfolk, Virginia, Alexander Lukter, and also Heidi from Edinburgh, and Cobb Fan out there in Western Australia. Almir says, the inter-imperialist conflicts in World War II really destroyed the traditional European powers. It's funny to see them in this sad state. Truly pathetic. Well, they should have been destroyed by World War I. I mean, World War I was the point where imperialism from the Europeans reached the point of no return, where it could no longer expand except by violently redividing the world. Then after World War II, they could only survive by being taken into a bloc with the United States. Now, that bloc continues to exist and will continue to exist for quite some time. So, the question is then what happens now? Now, the reason why they have to go along with the US isn't just that the US cracks the whip and they all have to jump and say how high. As I have said many times before, the reimposition of comprador rule in Russia, the bringing back of sort of a Yeltsin figure, or the breakup of Russia entirely, the more maximalist demand, this isn't just something which is in the interests of US imperialism. This is something which is in the interests of imperialism as a whole. So there's no contradiction here. The Germans, French, Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, Danes, Nordic countries, of course the British, are all invested in seeing Russia completely destroyed or laid bare for hyper-exploitation by Western capital, and to have its resources exploited, to have its industrial base assets stripped, to be again reduced to a state of neo-colonial dependency on the West. That is the agenda that they have. And it's not just an American or a British agenda, it's also a French, German, and all the other European countries you care to name, possibly except the Hungarians, the Slovaks, and the Serbs who are outside of the EU anyway. But all of the imperialist powers in Europe have this same shared agenda. So the idea that, oh, well, the sanctions against Russia are against the interests of the Europeans. Well, they're against the interests of European workers who, as a result, a direct result, end up paying more for their energy because of the cut-off of the Russian energy supply, or the chaos it created in the energy market, or the creating the ability of the energy companies to systematically rip them off. Yes, all of that's against European workers' interests, but the interests of the ruling class, the long-term interests of the ruling classes of Western Europe, of the imperialist powers, again, all of them are included in this, their interests go in the direction of shattering the Russian Federation and being able to asset strip it. So it's not, I repeat, not against the interests of the European ruling classes to have Russia defeated and broken and able to be subordinated. It's very much in their interests, because that way lies not just a revival of themselves via being able to exploit Russia, but also kills a key part of the multipolar system that's emerging and ends, as they would see it, ends threats to their ability to exploit nations in the Sahel, nations in the rest of the African continent, nations in Southeast Asia or South America and Central America. Taking out the Russian Federation or taking out the Putin system is absolutely crucial for them in terms of preserving their own system and restoring profitability. So this junk that these multipolar theorists and commentators talk about, the Russian war being against European interests, this isn't true. This isn't true. European interests and US interests are completely aligned on this. And the reason why the EU, as an entity, being the expression of the will of the German and French ruling classes, is so hardline, is because they need the defeat of the Russians urgently. Now, the bigger economic threat to the US is, of course, the Chinese, far more than it is the Russians. The Russians are an awkward one for the Europeans because, again, they've been popping up in nations in Africa with making security deals with local governments and the radical governments of the Sahel, led by Chani, Gaita, and the Burkinabes. Now, the way that this goes is that, of course, you have differing priorities in different sections of the imperial bloc, but ultimately the same priorities do prevail, which is that they don't want partnership with the Russians. They want the Russians destroyed and subordinated. They don't want partnership with the Chinese either. They've done deals with the Chinese out of necessity because China is becoming more and more strong and much stronger than the Europeans. The Europeans would love to see China destroyed and subordinated as much as the US does. The disagreement is over what the immediate priority is. The Europeans, principally, again, the French, the Germans, and we'll include the British in this as well, despite the fact they've formally speaking left the EU, they are looking at their immediate neighborhood and seeing that their priority is the immediate defeat of Russia. Closer to them, also would enable easy looting via easy access to the Russian landmass. It's extracting, potentially disrupting trade with China is going to be much more damaging and much more dangerous, which is why they want to take out what they regard as the easier option in the form of the Russian Federation first. These are the calculations that are being made, and we have to explain this to the workers, or at least the advanced workers in the West, that the calculations being made by the ruling classes are, of course, not in our interests, but in their interests. It's not that the European governments are acting against the interests of the European nations as a whole. They are acting against the interests of the working classes of those countries, but they are acting very much in the interests of the ruling classes of those countries. And this is an important distinction to make. People say, oh, Europe's destroying itself. Oh, why is Europe doing this? Europe, the imperialist countries in Europe, because, of course, the non-imperialist countries are dominated by the Western imperialists themselves. They are behaving in the way that they need to, given the nature of their systems. Crisis-riddled, late-stage imperialism requires infusions of vast amounts of loot just to keep itself going for another few years, and Russia is their chosen target. Right. Okay, just scrolling through some comments here. Yes, Alexander Luchter's comment about Schultz looking like a serial killer. He may well be. Who knows? You never know what these people are into. Good afternoon to Irish Partisan out there in a very wintry Minsk. Hello to Shanika McAdams. Hello to Nick. Hello to Albert. Hello to John. And Pittsburgh Dude. Rupert. And Waverley 610. Cobb Fan. Evansten. Evensten. And Svetlana, who asks, why does Keir Starmer always sound like a sanctimonious vicar preaching to the congregation? Well, that's his training. Sanctimonious lawyer arsehole. Let's have a look through the comments here. Backstreet's Back says, I got the feeling they wanted Ukraine to be initially defeated but create a draining insurgency. That's what they thought was going to happen, but they again miscalculated. They thought that the Russians were going all in on that special military operation in 2022. The Russian system favored a limited operation. Rather than a full-scale invasion. And yes, you can hear there the familiar sounds of the barking dog. Hopefully, who will calm down in just a moment. If not, I'm going to have to carry out an intervention of my own. Okay. Right. If you'll excuse me, I have apparently a rogue canine to deal with, so I'll be back in just a moment.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop.
All right, we're back again, looking at this now. So, we got a good question here from Cobb Fan, who says, I can see why the finance capitalists of Britain and the US must defeat the industrial capitalist powers like Russia. Why is Germany on board? Germany's on board because the priorities of German imperialism are still the same. What were the priorities of German imperialism 120 years ago? To expand their ability to hyper-exploit the underdeveloped areas in the east of Europe. What were the priorities of German imperialism in World War II? Same thing, pursued with an ever greater brutality due to the urgency of the situation for German imperialism. German imperialism is in a very, very deep crisis in the 30s and needed to rapidly expand and consolidate its hold over Ukraine and Western Russia. That's the reason, principal reason anyway, for the savagery and brutality of the Nazi conquest of the east of Europe and Russia. What is the priority of the reunified German imperialism now? Well, it's to hyper-exploit various parts of the European Union. So, for instance, the former Yugoslavian countries, the former people's democracies, are all principally tied to Germany economically, and be subject to exploitation by German capital. What is now some say, oh, well, Germany was getting cheap energy off the Russians. Why would they want to disrupt that? Well, imagine how much cheaper the energy would be if you got rid of the Putin system and imposed a comprador regime. Imagine also what German capital could get out of being able to unrestrictedly exploit Russian resources and labor. Because the Putin system, for all that it's a capitalist system, has essentially been trying to foster a sort of national capitalism. That's their plan. I don't think it's working particularly well. It's developed a protected system built on the old Soviet industrial legacy to the point where it can withstand the US sanctions regime, but they're trying to foster a national capitalist class, and it just won't work, basically. The Russian bourgeois will always remain a completely feeble creation because it was born far too late into a system that was already superseded, or should have been superseded. So don't make any mistakes here. The German ruling class are as interested in the complete conquest and subordination of Russia under comprador rule as the US and the British are. And if you go back and listen to the interviews I did with the German comrades from the KO communist organization, you'll see that Germany is going down, of course, the same path as Britain and the US, in it's becoming more and more financialized. Yes, they've still got a bigger manufacturing base than the British have, but again, like, capitalism naturally moves towards deindustrialization because, of course, the rate of profit falls to the point where domestically they can't make enough profit by producing commodities and exporting them. So they have to produce, they produce capital and export that and exploit labor and resources in other countries at a higher rate of exploitation than they will be able to domestically. And therefore, that's the way in which the capitalist class of these particular countries go. And so is true for Germany. Germany, again, retained more of its industrial base for very historically specific reasons, but it's going in the direction of more and more financialization now, and has been since at least the period of reunification. So Germany is an imperialist power, and it's becoming more of a typical imperialist power as time goes on. And so it requires the same thing as the other imperialist powers. So, and also, the industrial capitalists are losing, or even if they do, some of them remain distinct, are losing power to, like, German banks and German finance. German finance capital becoming more and more important now. So don't make the mistake that these the multipolarists make, which is in assuming that Germany is this perpetual industrial powerhouse. It's an imperialist power, meaning that the tendency is to shift more and more towards capital export rather than commodity export. And that has been happening in Germany over the course of many years. And so it requires the same thing that the British and the Americans require, which is the collapse and subordination of both Russia and China. But don't think just because they were getting cheap energy from the Russians that means the German ruling class, the German imperialists, are somehow going to be wanting to re-establish some fair and equal relationship with the Russian Federation. No, they don't. They want the Russian Federation conquered and subordinated. They need that as much as the Brits do. Well, Cobb fan makes a comment. Achieving a comprador class in Russia seems like just a wet dream. Well, they'd already achieved it once. Don't make the mistake of thinking, of believing the bullshitting of the Russian government and the Russian bourgeois themselves. There's a big comprador group in Russia that would roll over and play dead for the West if the West asked nicely enough, and they thought they could get away with it. The reason why they don't is because they probably couldn't get away with it at this stage. They're not politically strong enough. They're widely discredited, but they're there, and they will constantly seek to go back to the 1990s. This is what the KPRF constantly warns about. So it's not an insane plan. I don't think it will work, but it's not without basis. It's not without a basis in reality here. Again, there's too many people are listening to those who are basically pumping out like the version of reality that the Russian government would like everybody to believe, which is that, again, the problem with the Europeans is that they're just cucked. No. Problem with the Europeans, and particularly the Germans and the French, is that these are imperialist powers who, again, require the destruction of Russia. The problem with the Russian ruling class, the Russian capitalist class, is that they are this sort of pathetic, cringing class with no ability to actually push the country forward, either 100 years ago or now, and who, again, would surrender it all tomorrow if they possibly could. They persist in making these myths about themselves, about what they want for the country, about the wonderful nature of Russian nationalism today. And again, these are very weak creations, and we need to bear this in mind when making our calculations. Right, moving on to other comments. Rupert says the differences between the needs of the industrial class and the finance class have always been a fault line. No, I disagree. Because what happens is, in imperialist countries, the industrial, distinctly industrial bourgeois and the finance bourgeois, the money bourgeois, they merge together. That's the point. The creation of imperialism comes about when the ability to make money, the ability to profit successfly from manufacturing commodities and either selling them in the international market, exporting them. When that becomes compromised by the falling rate of profit, what do? Well, then you get the merger of industrial and money capital to create finance capital. This is Lenin's analysis. Finance capital is the merger of the two. So there is this idea, and it did exist for a while, where there are distinct capitals, whether there's distinct industrial capital and whether there's distinct just money capital, there'll be clashes between the two of them. Yes, that does happen. The point about imperialist powers is that the two, finance and industrial capital, become completely interwoven as the system develops. And this is true everywhere, where imperialism develops. So the German ruling class didn't object to the policy on Russia because, again, German industry and German industrial and money capital have been merged. So, like increasingly, it's becoming the case that, along with all the other imperialist powers, German industrial capital and money capital aren't distinct; they're merged together and into finance capital. And finance capital requires the complete subordination of every single potential market out there, so it can be hyper-exploited by their numerous business concerns. And again, like you look at Britain or you look at the United States, this is where you get the most developed forms of finance capital, where you have the complete merger of like banking and finance and industry together to form this, like these, what you would call like end stage capitalist monopolies. Okay. What is the obsession of Britain with Russia? Well, look, I think that this is somewhat, it's somewhat overstated. I think the idea that this is a perpetual, ongoing thing. There's several different stages of the British relationship with the different entities that have existed on the landmass now known as the Russian Federation. Back in the period of the Tsardom, going back over 200 years, the British were allied with the Tsardom against Napoleon, against revolutionary France. They were for years afterwards as well. They later got involved in a fight with each other in Crimea, as it was back then, as the British were trying to stop Russian expansion into what's now, of course, Ukraine, what had previously been Turkish-dominated areas under the Ottomans. There was, of course, the idea that the Russians were going to come south and take India, which I think was always a bit of a pipe dream on everybody's behalf. So there was a shifting relationship there in the 19th century. They then allied with each other again, and the British were getting exactly what they wanted out of the Tsardom, and the Russian bourgeois, because the British and the French were the leading investors. Germans were there too. US was there a little bit, but there's the British and the French were the leading investors into Russian industry, because, of course, Russian labor was very cheap at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. And, of course, by dominating the Russian bourgeois and the Russian Tsardom, which, by the way, the British and the French did do that, they gained control, not completely, but they gained a large degree of control over the Russian Tsardom and the Russian bourgeois, which is, of course, why the Russian bourgeois was so desperately keen on World War I, and why the Russian bourgeois government, after the overthrow of the Tsar, would not and could not pull out of it, because they were fucking owned by the British and the French. And so they essentially controlled late era period Tsarist Russia. So that's not exactly a rivalry, is it? That's more of a master-slave relationship. Fortunately, it was the Bolsheviks broke the slavery, turfed the British and the French out, and of course the British and the French didn't forget that in a hurry. Now you go through the period of the Soviet Union, of course the British and French imperialism diminished in power, but still remained rabidly hostile to the Soviet Union right up to the bitter fucking end, because of course they did, because it was a whole area of the world that for a time was denied to them in terms of exploitation. And you go back to the 1990s, the British and the French, British in particular, were all about welcoming in the comprador swines who were running Russia into the ground in the 90s, because, of course, they were restoring Russia to the place that it held in the pre-revolutionary period, which was that of a pathetic vassal state. And the British loved that. And it had Putin lived up to their expectations of being the sober Yeltsin, they would have continued to love Russia. So I think this, this is overstated, because what changes then is that Putin and his group try to institute a sort of, or try to boost a sort of national bourgeois system in the Russian Federation. And this is, of course, too much for the British and the Americans and the other imperialist powers. Any assertion of state sovereignty and any barrier to the hyper-exploitation of Russian labor and resources has to be destroyed. So Putin, of course, is no communist. Putin is no Bolshevik. Putin is trying to create a national bourgeois system. And that in itself is too much. And that's why he's ended up in on a collision course with the West. And if the Russian compradors were to get power back and surrender again completely to the West, then all hostility to Russia will be dropped again. So the British imperialist relationship with Russia is dependent upon how compliant a stooge regime exists in Moscow. If you have one that is as much of a stooge regime as the Tsardom was, then they're fine with them. They're allies. They're great heroes. We love Russian culture. Don't you love the ballet? If it's communists running it, then Russia is the most deadly place on earth that must be destroyed. If it's Yeltsin running it, welcome back. If it's the national bourgeois project of Putin running it, then again, this is the British will say that this is Satan personified. So it's about how their interests are served by each iteration of a government, of a system that exists in Russia. This idea that the sort of the Duginites and the Medvedev group who say that it is about British eternal hostility to Russia, well, this isn't true. This is about what kind of regime serves British imperialist interests at any given moment. Quite simple, really. If the regime that rolls over and plays dead and gives the British everything they want, then they're fine with you. If it's a regime that does anything other than that, then they'll try and kill you. These sound like overly simplistic explanations, but they have the virtue of being true. Okay. Almir asks, is there a possibility of a really hostile rivalry between the US and European ruling classes in the future? Or is that not a realistic option at all? No, not for now, because, again, it's too codependent a relationship. People say it's like it's all one way, that the US gets everything. And the US is the dominant partner. Make absolutely no mistake about that. The US is far more powerful than any individual European state. Let's just get that out of the way straight away. But again, look at the balance of the exchanges of capital. Look at the balance of trade. Yes, the US is constantly trying to get one over on its so-called European partners. They've been doing that for 80 plus years, probably, in fact, longer. But again, like, unless the US can find somewhere else that can provide the same investment opportunities and the same rate of return as investments in the collective Europe does, then again, Europe's going to retain a key place in US calculations for the foreseeable future. At the moment, the Trump group are trying some bargaining strategy which seeks to not downgrade the relationship, but get more out of it on behalf of the US, because Trump doesn't fucking understand the system he's running. So this is all negotiation tactics. And the only way that you're going to get like a direct conflict between the US and like any European country is if the US is basically kicked out. If any European country elects a government that would call time on NATO, that would call time on the US presence in Europe, and none of the bourgeois forces, not the current group, not the likes of the SPD in Germany or Macron's group in France, or Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage or Kemi Badenoch or Giorgia Meloni or Tusk or Duda or anybody else, is going to come up with that. Not in the immediate future. If, however, you get a government that comes in that is prepared to pull the trigger on NATO, then at that point you'll probably get some form of action. Might not be direct US military intervention, but it'll be something to protect their interests. So no, it won't be possible as long as the system remains as it is. The question of what happens in the near future, though, that's something different entirely. Slumbering Colossus asks, who the fuck are the British think they can rule the world? Have they slept through several centuries? Well, the unfortunate reality is that the British ruling class didn't rule the world. I think that would be putting it too strongly. They were the dominant imperialist power all the way through the 19th century. All the way into the early part of the 20th century. They got exposed in World War I for being much weaker than they thought they were by the Germans, and had to rely on the Americans to bail them out. But when you've accumulated that much capital from the brutal asset stripping and hyper-exploitation of Ireland, of India, of places like what's now Kenya, of what's now Malaysia, over many, many decades and decades, going back well over 2 centuries. And when you've accumulated that much, even after you've lost the land-based empire, even after you've lost and outsourced loads of your manufacturing capacity, you can still move a gigantic amount of capital around. Well, then you still have a considerable amount of power. So yes, Britain as an armed force, Britain as a sort of diplomatic power is diminished, but they can still move a hell of a lot of capital around. Not as much as they could. And they've still got a vast store of it that they're sitting on. So that buys an awful lot of power, an awful lot of influence in the world, and that shouldn't be underestimated. Don't make the mistake of underestimating the British or the French or the German imperialists. They're on the way down, yes, but they can still do damage on their way down. And of course, they still have their delusions that they are colossi, perhaps, bestriding the world. And that is a delusion. But it's also a delusion to say that they're straight up finished and it's all over. It's not. Let's make no mistake about this. What a coinky dink says Vanessa Beeley believes and many others believe that Russia allowed the collapse of Syria and to stymie the resistance, to appease the US and Israel, compradors of Russia, as a form of concession. Also to undercut Iran's influence in West Asia. Well, we don't know the truth of that. I mean, I think that what happened in Syria is that, I mean, I'll be straight up and say I haven't read the latest reports that Vanessa Beeley has written, so I'm not going to comment on her writing directly because I want to read it before I do. But this idea that, well, it's the Russians sold out and allowed the collapse of Syria. Now, the collapse of Syria, a very unfortunate thing, of course, in terms of resistance to the US imperialists in the region. This collapse of Syria came about because, quite literally, like large elements of the Syrian state machine were paid off and changed sides. That's what happened. So was it the Russians that guaranteed that large elements of the Syrian army ran away, switched sides, gave up, wouldn't fight? Was it the Russians who appointed incompetent and corrupt idiots to run the Syrian armed forces? Was it the Russians who were turning down Chinese investment into Syria for fear of offending the Gulf tyrannies? Did the Russians do all of that? Or did Assad do that? Or more to the point, did the government of Syria that was nominally run by President Assad do that? So let's get it straight here. There were a lot of opportunities for the Syrian government to progress in the later 2010s into the 2020s. And each time, the Syrian government, for internal reasons and because of the balance of class forces within the Syrian government, chose to try and compromise with the Gulf tyrannies, chose to defend the corrupt interests of the Syrian capitalist class, demoralized and hollowed out their own army, and refused to go for BRICS integration because of, again, fears of competition with the that were a representation of the fears of the Syrian capitalist class. All of that created a situation where, yes, on top of the problems presented by the long-term state of siege that the US imperialists and the British imperialists had placed on Syria, the state became hollowed out and large elements of it simply gave up, disappeared, got paid off, or switched sides, which is why Assad had to resign. Now, is that the fault of the Kremlin? Is that the fault of the Russians? Could the Russians have stopped the rot in the Syrian army? Could the Russians have stopped the large elements in the Syrian cabinet itself, declaring that it was all over and Assad had to resign? Were the Russians aware of the games being played by the Gulf Arabs? Or maybe they were. But could they have stopped any of that? That's the question. Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that principally the cause of the collapse of the Syrian government was the siege that was laid upon it by imperialism. Now, one can say accurately that the Ba'athist government made a lot of mistakes, that its compromised nature was exposed. Excuse me. That in the end, Assad himself was isolated by essentially a Syrian ruling class that had turned comprador. Now, all of that is true. Could the Russians have done more? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But this tendency to avoid, this tendency which some Syrian, pro-Syrian analysts have shown, to try and not mention the glaring problems that did exist within the late period Syrian state. Again, even acknowledging the fact that this is a product of the siege on Syria, the war waged by imperialism on Syria. There were options that they could have taken. There were options that could have been, paths that could have been followed that weren't for domestic Syrian reasons. Now, again, we can get into the role of the Russians when we know more, but until I know more about exactly what happened there, I'm going to go with the explanation that seems to be the most logical, the most correct, which is that this was an internal collapse brought about by contradictions within the Syrian system, again pushed to it by the war waged on the country by imperialism. But I would say that explanation, the Russians simply sold out, that ignores certain realities on the ground in Syria that are widely acknowledged now. The fact that large elements of the army were literally just gave up and melted away. Well, again, then you've got to investigate why that is. Were the Russians in control of all of that, or was it the Syrian government that was in control of that? It seems that the Syrian government was the one in control, and it was the Syrian government that essentially imploded. Okay, right, so we are on just past 1 o'clock. I'm going to draw things to a close for today. We're going to be back to later today with the show on Marxism and human relations. So please join us for that one. That's going to be a later show coming to you at 10:30 Perfidious Albion time. So please join us for that. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to the chat. Very interesting questions there. I thank you for all of them. Be sure to like and share this stream and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And your support makes all of this possible. Right. Be back with you again later today. Until then, I throw you back over to your usual musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they're ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
주체의 쌀두비를 우리 어떻게 성대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 붉은의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.